Okay, I spent the last 2 days putting together, I think, close to 50 packages of scions, seeds, and pollen to send out. They'll be going out anywhere between today and a couple days from now whenever I get my butt into town to get supplies. Someone asked a question and I thought, you know what, I should just do a video that covers all three: scions, seeds, pollen, how to use them, how to store them, and just get it all over with so everybody can just be referred to this video. Okay, so scions first. The scions will come wrapped in like a saran wrap. It's actually pallet wrap. They should be pretty much good until you need to graft them. So you can just stick those in your refrigerator. For the few Luddites out here that don't have refrigeration, you can put them on the north side of a building, in a cold garage, as long as they're not going to be exposed to really hard freezes. Like a little bit of frost, not a big deal, but you don't want them freezing hard. Anyway, put them in the fridge until you're ready to use them, and they probably should be fine that way. Far from always necessary, but it's always a good idea to take the scions before you graft them. Cut the end off new. Actually, I think it's better to cut it at a slope. Probably doesn't really matter though. Put it in water overnight. If they're at all dehydrated, they'll slurp up that water real fast. So just, you know, overnight's a good goal, and then graft them. If you're ever concerned about disease, it's never a bad idea to wash them with peroxide, just this like 3% stuff. You know, you can soak them in there for a few minutes, or just get a really wet rag with this stuff and wipe them down real good. So I don't send out anything that's horribly diseased on purpose, but it's a precaution you can take if you want to take the mile. I never do it. If you get a scion and you see these lines right here, I try not to send too many scions out with those. It's actually cicada damage. So we have this species of cicada here, not the ones that live underground for 17 years, but just ones that come out every year. And they have like a saw, I think, on their butt or on their mouth, and they cut a line and lay eggs in the bark here, and it just damages the wood a little bit. In severe cases like this, it can actually become a problem, but anything like this, you can just pretty much ignore it and graft around it. So one other thing is, if you get small scions, some of my scions are on the small side, and you need to make 2 grafts, all you need is a couple of buds in each graft. So like for this one, for instance, I could easily cut this right here. What I'd probably do, if the size is real different like this, it's good to put 2 scions in this, because that keeps, if they both take, it keeps both sides of this alive. And if it doesn't, like if you have one on one side and nothing on the other, and there's a big split here with a cleft graft, this side can start to die back. But if there's 2, it keeps it alive. But if one of them dies, you do 2. One of them dies, you still have at least 1. I think I talk about this in my whole, you know, grafting series a lot. So if you haven't watched that and you're going to do any grafting, absolutely watch it. And you may just want to watch it again. So what I would probably do is go ahead and make 1 cut. Make sure it's going to work, you know, so that's going to work. And now I can say, okay, well, I need, you know, just a couple of buds, but let's say with this one I could easily do 3 buds, and then I'll graft this into the other side. I graft stuff this size on a pretty regular basis, and it's not ideal, like it can dry out sooner and all that stuff, but if you take good precautions and everything goes well, it's really not a big deal. And then the last thing for this, if you're using small scions into larger wood, if this bark is a lot thicker than this bark, you have to line up the cambium, not the bark. So don't line up the outside of the bark, but look at where the line between the bark and wood is on each one and make that a line. So that's where the cambium is. The rapidly growing portion is the line between the bark and the wood. Get both of these guys in place, then you have insurance. And if both of them grow, which is ideal, you'll keep both sides of this alive. This will heal up super fast, and probably by the next season you can just clip one of them off and let the other one grow, and it'll heal up much faster that way. Now if the sizes aren't too different, let's say you have something like this and something like that, then you can still do a whip and tongue graft. Just cut this normal, like you would. Cut the tongue into it. And then take this one, and don't cut as deep. Just skim off the outside surface until it roughly matches. See? And do it that way. And again, pay attention to this cambial alignment. So this gets extra wide up here. You know, it's wider up there and it's a little narrower down here. So I'm going to take this in this case, and I'm going to pick a side. Like if this side is straighter, so I'm going to pick this side and line up one side really well and just leave the other one to whatever it ends up doing. So that way I have a nice long continuous line here. Chances are that at one or more points on this side it will also take and heal, and that's a really good graft too if you have the skill to pull that off. Alright, so one last piece of advice that I've proffered many times, and I hope people are listening to me. Sit down with a pile of prunings. If you're at all unsure about your skills, or you need practice, or you just want to warm up, get a big pile of these things and just make grafts. Just practice making the grafts over and over until you're getting nice flat cuts and good fits. I can't emphasize how much that helps, you know, to get that time in, and just check before you're going to take your Scion that you only have, you know, maybe one stick like this, and if you keep whittling it away, you're going to end up without anything left. So practice, practice, practice. Okay, somebody asked me about the seeds, and they said they heard that apple seeds don't germinate very well, and obviously we have a limited quantity. You want to make sure they do well. That's true of dried apple seeds, but none of the apple seeds I sent out this year were dried. So the problem with dried apple seeds is that you need to stratify them in the cold still. So usually what they do is they'll soak them up and then put them into some kind of medium like sawdust or something, store them in the refrigerator for a month or two to cold stratify. So that makes the seed think, oh, I've been through winter now, it's time to sprout, right? So they need a certain amount of cold. But all these are already stratified and they're fresh. So you can just put them in right away, and they have a real high germination rate usually. So you can have some problems though. You can have, the seeds could just rot. So it's better to get them planted sooner than later so they're in the soil and they can just start going. Since they've already been stratified, if they get any inkling of warmth, and I'm not talking about warm, I'm just talking about not in the refrigerator, they will grow rapidly, because a lot of these will start sprouting anytime. In fact, some have already started to sprout, some of the varieties. And since they're going to be in the mail for a few days, they may start to sprout in the mail too, and you'll see that. And that's totally fine. Most of them are shipped with a little bit of damp sawdust, and they're going to be fine until you're ready to put them in. But I think it's better to get them in sooner. So one more thing to watch out for is mold. Like if you need to store them for a while, they can eventually start to mold in the bag. There might be a little bit of, like, you know, apple fruit residue on the seed or something like that. It's better not to let them get to that stage, and that's another reason to get them planted sooner than later. Another thing can happen is damping off disease. So this is basically a fungus that attacks the base of a young seedling as it comes up. And the best way to prevent that is not overwatering and having good air circulation. You know, once you get the seeds, water them in really well the first time, and you can even do that for a couple of days till they sprout. But then after they sprout, wait until the surface of the soil dries out. That's a pretty good indicator that it's a good time to water. If you keep putting water on it and keeping it really soggy, especially if there's not good air circulation like in a greenhouse, and it gets extra warm for a couple of days, sometimes you'll get rot at the base and the whole thing will just wilt and fall over. Another way to prevent that is to use sterile soil. So if you're not planting very many seeds, just take a baking pan, like a, I don't know, a cake pan or something, put your soil in that, stick it in the oven at 225 or 200 degrees, just until it gets hot through, and that can help a little bit as well. As far as planting them, any good potting mix that you would start your seeds in, I make my own out of, like, you know, compost and sand and whatever stuff's around. I actually have a video on that you can watch. And I think the only other problem I've really had, and it's a bad problem, is mice in the greenhouse. Every year in the greenhouse I can trap sometimes a dozen or more mice in a short amount of time. They like to move in there because it's dry and there's yummy little seedlings to munch on, and they'll just bite off the really young seedlings, and then that's it. You know, that seedling's gone forever. Lost unique genetic material. I'll just make sure that I keep traps set in the greenhouse before I actually plant the seeds, and that works just fine. Like, I can keep them trapped out and I'll rarely lose any if I'm just really on top of it. So I'm just going to finish this little SkillCult logo, and then we can move on. Pollen. You will see that there's not a lot of pollen in these containers. I don't know if you can see, but there's a yellow powder. That's a lot of pollen, actually, in terms of how much it takes to pollinate. It's just a matter of not wasting it. I started using a Q-tip last year on someone's recommendation, and I think before that I'd probably just kind of thought that a lot of the pollen would get lost inside the fibers here. But if you twist it up, like take each one and twist it tighter, you know, if you spin it in a certain direction, man, my fingers are dirty, in a certain direction, then that'll help a lot. And I just ordered some black Q-tips. I just found out, I was thinking, wow, it'd be great to have a black Q-tip, not just a black container, because then you could see all the pollen on there and you wouldn't lose any. And I thought, I bet someone makes black Q-tips as at least a novelty. Turns out they're popular in Japan. And so I ordered some, and next year I'll ship pollen with black Q-tips. So anyway, spin your Q-tip up tighter so that there's no loose fiber that the pollen's going to get down inside there and get lost. Also, don't just stick the thing in there and wipe all around. You only need a little bit, and you want to know where it is. So take this and wipe it on the inside of the bag just a little bit, and you'll be able to see that little bit of pollen. It's in a concentrated area. What'll happen is if you have too much on there and you're haphazard about it and just kind of like rubbing it, it'll flake off and fall, so the pollen will fall off. So just take that little bit and just tap it. And if you can see well enough, if you're young enough to see well or have reading glasses, you'll actually be able to see the pollen sticking to the female parts of the flower, and you don't need very much of that on there. Just tap it a few times and you're good. So with diligence and maybe some magnification, you can really make this amount of pollen go a long way, and this is enough to do a whole lot of pollinations. So next year I'm going to ship in these black containers, so we'll be able to see the black pollen against that, and also black Q-tips. So we'll be all set then. Don't leave it in the sun. I think it's better stored in, you know, a cool area if possible, and don't get any moisture inside of here. But when you're done, I think you should just take this, seal it up, and stick this in the freezer until next year. And I'd say there's probably a real good chance it's still going to be good. I'm going to try to test that theory out, and I also have pollen that's been stored at room temperature now for 2 years. So I'll be trying some of that this spring, and if that works, then I think, you know, it's pretty safe to assume that we can keep this stuff for a while when it's really dry in the freezer. Okay, let's talk about pollination, and there are kind of levels to this that you can take, you know, different precautions, levels of precaution you can take to make sure that the flower is pollinated with the pollen you want, right? So we have the flower, which has the female parts, and then we're taking the pollen, which is the male part of a different flower, and we're using that to pollinate. If we look at a flower, an apple flower like this, then it's got some little things in the middle here. There's 5 of those. And then it has these little balls around the outside that look like this, and there's a whole bunch of those. So these are the boy parts, and these the girl parts. Is that right? Is that the right symbols? I think. If you leave these on the flower, there's some chance in some varieties of self-pollination because these produce pollen. If you leave the petals on, there is a, you know, 100% chance that bees and bugs are going to visit this flower and try to pollinate it and get what they want out of it. If you take the petals off, then suddenly this bullseye target thing that's like there to attract insects, it's there to say, look, I'm ready, come and get me, that's gone, and the bees will lose interest because they just think it's another flower that has already done its thing. Professionals do this in numerous different ways. Like a real common one is to just cage your entire bush, right? So the whole tree is in a cage and it's covered in flowers, and you just open it once a day and you go in there with pollen and you just pollinate them. You leave these on because there's no bees to come and use them. You leave these on because in most cases it's not going to self-pollinate, and that's that. In other cases, they'll take the flower here and cut off all the petals and then these are the little male guys around the edge. Cut off all of those and just leave the girl parts in the middle. So then we have this like stubby thing like this with no boy parts and just girl parts, and bees don't want to visit it. Then you can pollinate that. Now I've done that a lot by cutting these little guys off with very small scissors, like little tiny, you know, trimmer scissors. And I've also taken them off by taking a comb, like a hair comb, a fine hair comb, and combing over them. So you put the comb here behind these little balls and you pull it forward and it scrapes them off. Now the worst year pollinating I've ever had is a year that I did that, and I combed these off instead of cutting them off. I'm not sure if that's why, but I suspect that I may have damaged the girl parts here. So what I would recommend is taking off the petals, and then if you remove these, which I mostly am not anymore because it's just too time consuming, and I just think that the risk of self-pollination is pretty low, then cut them off. It takes a long time, but if you're not doing very many pollinations, it's not that big of a deal. Cut them off with scissors, and then you only have the girl parts and the bees don't want to come. Now if you really want to be careful, you do this all before the flower opens. So originally you walk up to a flower and it's in this stage where there's a big balloon and it looks like it's just about to open, maybe like the next day, and you tear these petals off. So no bee has ever been in here, no bug has ever been in here, so they can't be pollinated by anything else. And then you do this, emasculate it, get rid of this self-pollination issue, however small of an issue it is. And then after you make the pollination, you bag it, the whole thing, and tie it off. That way you're pretty much 100% sure that it's been pollinated the way that you want it. But I think that's a pretty ridiculous extreme for any of us to go to, and I don't think there's a good reason. So in summary, I would say, you know, get them in this stage, the balloon stage, for sure, because as soon as they open, bees are going to get in there and pollinate it. Tear off those petals, either leave these or don't, pollinate it, and if the petals aren't there, it's very unlikely that it's going to get pollinated much by any other insects. And that's good enough for me. I think it's a good idea to come back and hit these again the next day just to top them off and make sure that you got enough pollen on there. Make sure they're receptive, because they are receptive when the flower is in this balloon stage. It seems, you know, it works because I do it all the time. But I think that they probably become slightly more receptive over the next day or two. So it really doesn't hurt to come out maybe the next morning and do this again. A good time to pollinate is late morning, say like 10 to noon or something like that. It's real warm and active on a good sunny day when everything's like buzzing and there's enough warmth that the flowers are going to do well. But, you know, if you don't have time to do it then, don't just wait and not do it. Go ahead and do it. And then if you have time, you could come back the next morning and hit them again at a better time. Okay, so I sent out a lot of seeds, quite a few intentional cross-pollinations, a lot of open-pollinated Wixen, Pink Parfait, Rubaiyat. That's exciting to think of all those unique apple genetics out there, just hundreds of seeds that could potentially turn into something really interesting. I've talked about this before, but with the red-fleshed apples, we're dealing with a lot of pretty primitive genes, and this is really the reason I want to work with these apples the most. I mean, they're just fun to work with and they're exciting, but it's because we have this gene pool that you could say is like contaminated. That's not really the right term, but it has a lot of residual primitive characteristics because it was bred from more primitive apples that haven't been bred into these more refined forms of like large, juicy, sweet, you know, excellent textured, etc., etc. I think that's going to kind of dilute the percentage of really good apples that come out of those kind of crosses. But we need to be thinking kind of into the next generation a little bit. So by making these crosses and saying, you know, I'm crossing this apple that has some like negative primitive traits that we really don't want with a high quality dessert apple, well, I've just diluted those primitive genes that little bit more. And this is a progressive process, right? So we get to go back and say, look over the last, you know, hundreds of years, really probably more, and we're picking out all these apples that have been selected and selected and selected, and now they're being bred really intentionally so we can take advantage of, say, apples like Gold Rush, Sweet 16, and Williams Pride, which are all excellent apples, and they've been bred to have disease resistance that, you know, is actually a problem. Like some of those are resistant to scab, I think maybe all of them, and the red flesh apples tend to get scab really badly, for instance. So we can start breeding that out, and then we can take other apples that are other crosses of red flesh apples and good dessert apples and put those together, and then we start to like get this refining process going down. So in the long run, it may be that, you know, the apple that you grow from your red fleshed dessert cross is the next best breeding parent rather than the next best apple. That's kind of the progression. And basically what I wanted to do is take the work that Albert Etter did, breeding Pink Parfait, Rubaiyat, Grenadine, Pink Pearl, Pink Pearmain, all these red-fleshed apples that he was working on, and continue that linear process, because the only one that I know of that he released is Pink Pearl. There may have been one more, but the only one I can think of right now is Pink Pearl. And it's not really the best of the lot, but, you know, for whatever reasons, he thought it had more, you know, potential for success in the market. But he did a lot of work to get that far and get to that stage and move onward. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. And the other thing is there's groups all over the world working on red fleshed apples. So as those start to come out, like the Red Love line that's bred by Marcus Cobalt, and you can look at his videos on YouTube, look up Red Love, that's one word, Red Love. He talks about his breeding process and everything. So someone was just telling me that some of those are scab resistant. That's awesome. So, you know, eventually you can start using those in the breeding process too, getting more and more refined to get the apple that we really want, which to me is a sweet, excellently textured, long keeping, with deep red flesh and lots of that red, yummy berry flavor. And I think that's very possible, and I actually don't think it's probably that far off. But over this process, we have to kind of start dropping off some of those negative traits like poor texture, not keeping well, getting scab really bad and stuff like that. Early drops is a problem with some of them, like Christmas Pink drops really bad. Grenadine drops pretty bad. Grenadine ripens unevenly. A lot of them will turn waxy and just fall off the tree prematurely. Okay, I could go on and on about this stuff, but since you can't even see my face, I'm not going to, and we'll save that for other videos. I have some interesting ideas about plant breeding and ways to network and stuff like that. But I'll say in the meantime that we need a forum somewhere for pome fruit breeders, apples, pears, and you might as well include the other ones like quince and medlar and stuff like that. You could just trade pollen with people and trade scions and trade. Eventually I'm going to have pollen from my crosses, and I can offer that to you guys, so you're a generation ahead of the curve in breeding when you start. And also trialing varieties, like for those people who aren't doing it for money and just want people to take their new variety and try it in different places and talk about it and promote it and stuff like that, you know, it'll be good for that. So I really think we need that. No way I'm going to bite that project off. I wouldn't even be a moderator. I would participate to some extent. Anyway, I could expand that idea into a much broader model of something I think should exist, but I don't want to get into it now because it's too much, and I have to go to town today and mail all those packages. So they should be mailed. If I don't do that today, it'll be the next few days. So most people will probably get a tracking number through PayPal as a notification that you can keep track. So if you're in a really cold area, you could intercept that package and make sure that it doesn't, you know, freeze to death, or tell the post office to hold it for you or something like that. It may say that they've already shipped, but the tracking number won't show that they've moved because I haven't actually put them in the mail yet. And then once they start moving, you should be able to track them pretty close. So good luck and have fun. So much fun doing fruit tree projects and getting excited about your orchard or your grafts and watching them grow, and your seedlings. How exciting is that, to have these seeds that are just genetically unique and they could throw all kinds of stuff, good stuff, bad stuff, totally unique stuff, weird flavors, weird looking, long keeping, who knows. Good times.